Outside the Grand Palace of Westminster, the heart of British governance, stands an imposing bronze statue. A crowned king, sword held high, sits astride a powerful war horse. It's a potent symbol of English monarchy, of martial valor, and of national pride. The man immortalized is King Richard I, known to history as Coeur de Lion, the Lion Heart. Yet, this quintessential image of an English hero conceals a startling paradox. During a 10-year reign from 1189 to 1199, this legendary king spent, by most historical estimates, a grand total of 6 months on English soil. How did a man so physically detached from England become one of its most enduring national symbols? It's a story of identity, empire, and continental ambition. To understand why Richard was an absentee king, we must first accept that he was never truly an English king to begin with. Richard was born in Oxford in September 1157, a fact that ties him geographically to England from his first breath. But this detail is misleading, and his world was thoroughly and unalterably French. His parents were Henry II, the first Plantagenet king of England, and the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine. Both were of French birth and culture. Neither spoke English, and the language of their court was French. While Richard spent his earliest years in England with an English wet nurse named Hodierna, this interlude was brief. At the age of 7, he was taken to the continent, and it was there, in the sun-drenched lands of southern France, that his identity was forged. The defining relationship of Richard's life wasn't with his powerful but often adversarial father, but with his mother, Eleanor. Richard was her favorite son, the child who most resembled her in temperament and spirit. From 1168, Eleanor took up residence in her ancestral Duchy of Aquitaine, a vast and wealthy territory that was hers by right. She kept Richard by her side, deliberately grooming him to be her heir and the future ruler of this fiercely independent land. At just 14, he was formally invested as Duke of Aquitaine. He grew up immersed in the sophisticated culture of southern France, a world of chivalric knights, courtly love, and troubadours. This was arguably the most stereotypically high medieval location imaginable, and it couldn't have been more different from England. He wasn't just a consumer of this pinnacle of high medieval culture. He was a participant, composing his own poetry and songs in French and the local dialect. Aquitaine wasn't just a territory he was assigned to govern. By all accounts, he considered it his true home. To grasp Richard's priorities, one must understand the political entity he was born to rule. It wasn't a unified nation-state in the modern sense. Historians call it the Angevin Empire, a sprawling collection of territories held together not by a common identity, but by personal allegiance to a single family, the Plantagenets. This quote-unquote empire stretched from the borders of Scotland down to the Pyrenees Mountains, encompassing all of England, Ireland, and more than half of modern France. In fact, the family's continental possessions were significantly larger than England itself. Richard ruled these lands under different titles. He was king in England, but in France, he was Duke of Normandy, Duke of Aquitaine, and Count of Anjou. Interestingly, this made him a vassal of the French king for those French lands. England was just one piece, albeit a wealthy and prestigious one, in a vast cross-channel patchwork of personal domains. The modern criticism of Richard as a bad English king for his absenteeism is therefore anachronistic. It imposes the expectations of a modern nation-state onto a medieval feudal reality. Richard's identity was forged in Aquitaine. His primary political power base was on the continent, and his most cherished inheritance came from his mother. His domains were vast and constantly threatened, particularly in France, and spending the majority of one's time defending those continental heartlands wasn't neglect. It was the fundamental job description of a feudal king to protect his subjects. In this system, his English subjects had no particular precedence over his continental subjects, and from a personal perspective, he likely felt more connection to his French subjects. Fundamentally, Richard was an Angevin prince, who also happened to wear the English crown. When Richard was finally crowned King of England in September 1889, his mind wasn't on English governance. Instead, it was thousands of miles away, in the Holy Land. His one, all-consuming ambition was to take up the cross and lead the Third Crusade to recapture Jerusalem, which had fallen to the great Sultan Saladin in 1187. This personal obsession was the primary driver for his first, longest, and most famous absence. After his coronation, he remained in England only long enough to prepare for this conflict, departing in the summer of 1190. He would not set foot in the kingdom again for more than 4 years. To finance an enterprise as colossal as a crusade, Richard treated England with the unsentimental pragmatism of a banker. He viewed the kingdom as a cash cow, a source of funds to be milked for his grander purposes. He was able to do this because England possessed a remarkably efficient and centralized system of administration and taxation. This was a legacy of his Norman predecessors that was unmatched in most of his French domains. While his French domains may have technically been far wealthier, as a percentage of economic output, less of this ended up in the royal coffers comparatively. Richard's fundraising campaign was swift and ruthless. He emptied the royal treasury, which his father had filled with funds from a special Saladin tithe, which was collected almost exclusively in England in 1188. He raised taxes and sold off anything of value. Official positions, lands, and other royal privileges were auctioned to the highest bidder. In a move that demonstrated both his focus and his detachment, he sold Scotland's oath of subservience back to its king, William the Lion, for an extremely hefty sum. As later scholars have noted, he likely would have sold London itself, if there was anyone who could afford it. The crusade itself explains not only the duration of his absence, but also why his return would be so fraught with peril. He proved himself a military commander of considerable genius. On his way to the Holy Land, he conquered the kingdoms of Sicily and Cyprus, securing vital supply lines. He arrived at the long-stalled siege of Acre in June 1191, and with his energy and expertise, brought it to a successful conclusion within weeks. He then led the Crusaders to a brilliant victory over Saladin's forces at the Battle of Arsuf. Yet, the ultimate prize, Jerusalem, remained out of reach. More damaging in the long run, however, were the powerful enemies he made among his supposed allies. He deeply offended King Philip II of France, his chief rival, who abandoned the crusade early to return to France and plot against him. At the siege of Acre, he publicly humiliated Duke Leopold of Austria by tearing down his banner, an act of arrogance that the Duke would neither forgive nor forget. This act of extreme disrespect would be a direct cause of Richard's further absence from his holdings. Richard's journey home in late 1192 was a desperate affair. With the French king blocking the direct sea routes, he was forced to take a perilous path up the Adriatic Sea. A storm wrecked his ship, forcing him and a few attendants to travel overland in disguise, straight through the territory of his new enemy, Duke Leopold of Austria. Duke Leopold was, to put it extremely mildly, extremely upset at the level of disrespect he had been shown at the siege. In December 1192, near Vienna, the disguise failed. The King of England was captured and thrown into Leopold's castle at Dürnstein. Soon after, he was sold like a prize commodity to an even more powerful foe, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, who also bore a grudge against the Plantagenets. Richard's imprisonment created a dangerous power vacuum that his enemies rushed to fill. His own brother John, whom Richard had never fully trusted, saw his chance to seize power. John formed a treacherous alliance with King Philip of France. While Richard languished in a German prison, Philip launched a full-scale assault on Richard's vital territories in Normandy, and John attempted to raise a rebellion in England. The two even conspired together and offered the emperor a truly massive sum of money to prolong Richard's captivity. And I'm not exaggerating here, they offered the Holy Roman Emperor 18 tons of silver just to prolong the event. In modern terms, this silver would be worth $20 billion today. However, to use more relevant contemporary comparisons, historians have estimated that this amount could fund 10,000 knights and their households for 1 year. In essence, the future King John and King Philip were willing to hand over extreme wealth to their already extremely powerful neighbor. But then things got worse, and the price to actually win Richard's freedom was beyond staggering. Emperor Henry VI demanded 3 times the entire annual income of the English crown, the equivalent of almost 40 tons of silver. And at this point, I need to remind everyone that this could have all been avoided if Richard simply respected Duke Leopold's flag at the siege they won together. In terms of monetary value, Richard's lapse of judgment or extreme pride may have been the most expensive act of disrespect in human history. Raising this ransom placed a crippling burden on England. It required a 25% tax on all income and property, the confiscation of gold and silver treasures from every church in the land, and other special levies. For the second time in less than 5 years, the kingdom's wealth was drained to fund its absent king's foreign affairs. The conspiracy between John and Philip revealed the inherent weakness of the Angevin Empire, and also reveals why many historians are uncomfortable with the term empire for it. It was a dominion held together only by the personal authority and presence of its ruler, with each component maintaining its independence outside the personal union. Richard's time in England as king consisted of 2 fleeting visits. The first was for his coronation and to launch his crusade fundraising, lasting from September 1189 to the summer of 1190. His second visit was even shorter and somehow even more businesslike. Ransomed and released, he finally landed in England in March 1194. He stayed just long enough to perform a second symbolic coronation to erase the humiliation of his captivity and to formally forgive his treacherous brother John. However, the main purpose of his visit, and why he had to issue the apologies, was because he was really in England to gather even more money. He was about to take the fight back to King Philip, his arch-nemesis, and by May 1194, he had sailed from Portsmouth to France, never to return. The final 5 years of Richard's life were consumed by a single grinding purpose: fighting a relentless battle against Philip II to reclaim his lost French lands. While many modern people see this as yet another foreign adventure, to Richard this was a battle for his homeland. Normandy was the ancestral core of the Angevin inheritance, and Aquitaine was his personal domain and the land of his youth. He was fighting to defend the territories that defined him, his family, and his power. In this final campaign, his martial genius was on full display, and he systematically reversed many of Philip's gains and fortified his lands. Fittingly, Richard would perish in the heart of his French domains. In April 1199, while besieging the minor castle of Chalus-Chabrol in Limousin, part of his beloved Aquitaine, he was struck by a crossbow bolt. His body wasn't brought back to England, but rather, he was buried at Fontevraud Abbey in Anjou, forever cementing his identity as a great continental lord of the Angevin dynasty. The historical consensus is clear. Richard the Lionheart wasn't a bad king in general, but perhaps was a bad ruler of his English holdings in particular. He was a masterful soldier king and a shrewd leader capable of inspiring extreme loyalty and commanding the respect of both his friends and foes. His priorities, the crusade and the defense of his French lands, were perfectly logical for a 12th century Christian warrior prince. He was a product of the Angevin political system, a French feudal lord first, an English king second. Ironically, it was Richard's very absence that secured his legendary status in England. He wasn't present to be blamed for high taxes or the mundane struggles of governance. Instead, he became an idealized, offstage hero, the good King Richard of the Robin Hood legends. He was a perfect and romanticized foil to his brother John, whose tyrannical and disastrous reign was an all-too-present reality for the English people. Richard the Lionheart was, in essence, the cool, absentee dad of medieval England. His rare visits home were dramatic. He'd return like a hero, raise money for his campaigns, or resolve disputes with flair, then head back out. He'd also tell some cool stories about his conquests, and promise that if you just gave him some funding, he'd come back and tell even more cool stories in the future. Meanwhile, his younger brother John was stuck as the everyday parent, enforcing rules, collecting taxes, and making unpopular decisions. And quite frankly, John was terrible at this, both while he was filling in for his brother and while ruling in his own right. My personal opinion is that without the disastrous rule of King John, Richard would have been remembered simply as a warrior king, rather than as a legendary national hero of England. After all, Richard was a great ruler in many respects, but it's hard to make the argument that he acted in the best interests of England in a way that would earn national hero status. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy, just reminding you to like and subscribe, and also to share this video. Also, if you're in the mood for something different, check out my other YouTube channels or my podcast by clicking the links or in the description below. Imagine a world that no longer exists. Not the drained, orderly farmland of modern East Anglia, but a primeval landscape from the 11th century. It was a watery wilderness of swamps, treacherous bogs, and vast, rustling reed beds that stretched to the horizon. This was the Fens, a bewildering labyrinth where mist clung to the water, and solid ground was often an illusion. It was a place where rivers disappeared into murky lakes, and isolated islands of clay rose like ships from a stagnant sea. Survival here didn't depend on the brute force of armies, but on an intimate knowledge of the secret paths and hidden waterways. This landscape was a character in itself, a natural fortress that bred a unique kind of person and a unique kind of rebel. From this mist, a figure emerges, not clearly at first, but like a ghost. He is the embodiment of a conquered people's defiance, the last flicker of resistance against an unstoppable new order. This man is Herewald, a name that would echo through the centuries, later earning the epithet the Wake, which may have meant the Watchful. He stands balanced precariously between documented history and swirling myth. He's a man whose real existence is confirmed by the cold records of his conquerors, yet whose life story is heavily woven from folklore and legend. This raises the central questions that have fascinated historians for centuries. How did a single dispossessed landowner from Lincolnshire become the last best hope for Anglo-Saxon England? Was he a patriotic hero fighting for a lost cause, a ruthless opportunist driven by personal revenge, or something more complex? To understand Herewald, we first have to understand the cataclysm that created him. In 1066, Duke William of Normandy crossed the English Channel, and at the Battle of Hastings, he shattered the Anglo-Saxon army and eliminated its king, Harold Godwinson. By Christmas Day of that year, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey, but his victory was far from complete. What followed wasn't just a change of monarch, it was a systematic and brutal dismantling of an entire world. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was almost completely erased, its lands carved up and handed to about 180 of William's most loyal Norman tenants-in-chief. Norman French became the language of the court, of law, and of power, while the English vernacular was relegated to the conquered masses. Across the country, Anglo-Saxon bishops and abbots were replaced by Norman clerics, seizing control of the church, one of the most powerful institutions of the age. This societal revolution created a deep well of resentment and a class of dispossessed and furious English nobles and local lords. These lords, known as thanes, weren't prepared to take the upending of their social order lightly, and rebellion was inevitable. In the years immediately following the conquest, uprisings flared across the kingdom. William's response to these challenges was swift and merciless. His campaign to crush the northern rebellions, known as the Harrying of the North, was an act of incredible brutality that laid waste to vast swathes of Yorkshire and beyond. By the time Harold began his fight, he was not the first to resist, but he would be the last to lead a large-scale, organized rebellion against the conqueror. Our firmest anchor to his existence comes from the conquerors themselves. The Domesday Book, William's great survey of his new kingdom compiled in 1086, records a man named Harold as a landowner in southwestern Lincolnshire before the conquest. He held lands as a tenant of the powerful abbeys of Peterborough and Croyland, placing him squarely in the fenlands he would later make his fortress. This is the bedrock of fact upon which the legend is built. His parentage, however, is a matter of intense debate. The earliest detailed account of his life, a 12th century Latin text called the Gesta Herowardi, names his father as Leofric of Bourne, a local Lincolnshire nobleman. Later, more romantic tales tried to connect him to the famous Earl Leofric of Mercia and his wife, Lady Godiva, but there is no historical evidence to support this prestigious lineage. More compelling is a modern theory suggesting he was of Anglo-Danish heritage. This theory claims that his father was a prominent Danish thane named Asketil. This connection isn't a minor biographical detail. It's the geopolitical key that unlocks the strategy of his entire rebellion. It explains how an otherwise obscure local lord could summon a Danish fleet to his aid, attempting to reignite the old Anglo-Scandinavian alliance that the Norman conquest had shattered. His fight was not just for a lost England, but for a lost Anglo-Norse world order. According to the Gesta, Harold was a handsome, bold, but fiercely rebellious youth. His disruptive behavior was so extreme that his own father petitioned King Edward the Confessor to have him declared an outlaw and banished from the kingdom at the age of 18. It was during this exile that he forged himself into the warrior who would later defy the Normans. He traveled to Flanders, where he became a highly successful and respected mercenary in the service of Count Baldwin V. The stories from this period are filled with legendary embellishments, including a story about him combating a giant bear. Harold returned to England sometime between 1067 and 1069, a seasoned warrior returning to a home he no longer recognized. He found his family's lands seized and given to a Norman lord, his father dead, and his brother slain. In fact, according to the Gesta, his brother's severed head was impaled on a spike at the gate of their own home, as a grim warning. This deeply personal tragedy was the spark that ignited the Fenland Rebellion. The Gesta tells a story of brutal, symbolic revenge. Harold, with a small band of followers, is said to have infiltrated a feast where the Normans responsible were celebrating their new acquisitions. Finding them drunk and mocking the English, he exacted his vengeance, slaughtering 15 of them and replacing his brother's head on the gate with those men. This act, whether entirely factual or not, became a foundational legend of his resistance. From this moment of personal vengeance, the rebellion grew. Herewald established his base of operations on the Isle of Ely, a large clay island that was a natural fortress, surrounded by the impassable marshes and waterways of the fens. It quickly became a magnet for the last remnants of Anglo-Saxon resistance. The crucial moment came in 1070, when King Svein II of Denmark, sensing opportunity in the English turmoil, sent a fleet to the English coast. Herewald, likely leveraging his Anglo-Danish heritage, forged an alliance with them. Their first major joint operation was an attack on Peterborough Abbey in June 1070. This was a deeply controversial act, and the motivations were complex. The official justification was to, quote, rescue the abbey's vast treasures from the hands of its newly appointed Norman abbot. While this does sound like a very convenient excuse to steal large quantities of treasure from a sacred space, there was some truth to this. The Norman abbot who had been appointed to watch over the abbey was embezzling the funds it generated and making himself fabulously wealthy in the process. The raid on the Golden Borough, as Peterborough was known for its wealth, was a stunning success. Unfortunately for the Anglo-Saxons, the Danes, having secured an immense hoard of gold and silver, got in touch with their Viking heritage. They promptly accepted a bribe from King William, abandoned Herewald, and sailed for home, leaving the rebellion stripped of its main military force and its newfound treasury. This act of betrayal was a devastating blow. Despite the departure of the Danes, Herewald's defiance had captured the imagination of the beleaguered English. His reputation grew, and Ely became the final rallying point for those still willing to fight. The most significant figure to join him was Morcar, the former Earl of Northumbria, a high-ranking Anglo-Saxon noble who had been displaced by William's regime. Morcar's arrival, along with other fugitives, transformed Herewald's campaign from a local uprising into the last large-scale, organized Anglo-Saxon rebellion against Norman rule. However, the rebellion wasn't winning the hearts and minds of everyone in the Anglo-Saxon sphere. While the sacking of Peterborough had secured a fleeting victory, it came at a terrible cost. The act of desecrating one of England's holiest sites led to the excommunication of the band of patriotic rebels. It ensured that the primary record keepers of the age, the monks of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle at Peterborough, would forever paint him as a villain. He lost the narrative war, alienating potential pious supporters and tainting his legacy in the historical record for centuries to come. By 1061, William the Conqueror could no longer ignore the festering rebellion in the fens. Taking the threat with the utmost seriousness, he marched his army to the edge of the marshes and took personal command of the siege of Ely. What followed was a clash of worlds, the brute force of Europe's finest heavy cavalry and infantry against the cunning guerrilla tactics of a local leader using his environment as a weapon. The dramatic, if somewhat fantastical, accounts of the siege read like an epic. The Normans, accustomed to open field battles and sieges of castles, were utterly confounded by the terrain. Their first major effort involved constructing a massive timber causeway, said to be a mile long, to launch a direct assault on the island. The attempt ended in disaster when the structure collapsed under the weight of armored knights and their horses, sending hundreds of soldiers plunging into the swampy depths to drown. Herewald's tactics were born of this landscape. When the Normans tried again to build a causeway, Herewald had his men hide in the reeds and set them ablaze, engulfing the attackers in fire and smoke. Perhaps the most bizarre tale from the siege involves the Normans resorting to psychological warfare. They allegedly constructed a wooden siege tower and placed a witch atop it to hurl curses and spells at the English defenders. In a moment of pure folklore, Herewald and his men reportedly managed to set fire to the tower, causing it to collapse and eliminate the witch. These stories, while likely embellished, speak to the perception of Herewald as a resourceful and cunning leader, capable of outwitting his powerful foe at every turn. In the end, however, the fortress of reeds fell not to Norman swords, but to Norman silver. Frustrated by his military failures, William turned to a more subtle weapon: bribery. He approached the monks of Ely Abbey, who, perhaps fearing the destruction of their monastery or seeing the futility of the resistance, accepted his offer. They betrayed Herewald and showed the Norman army a secret, safe path through the marshes. This act of treachery sealed the rebellion's fate. William's victory demonstrated a core tenet of his statecraft. Subversion and the exploitation of internal divisions are equally effective tools of conquest. Surrounded and betrayed, the stronghold was finally captured. Earl Morcar was taken prisoner and would spend the rest of his life in a Norman dungeon. But in one last, legendary act of defiance, Herewald and a small band of his most loyal followers slipped through the Norman lines, vanished into the wild fens, and escaped. This final escape, noted in all the earliest sources, was the moment the man disappeared and the myth was born. What happened to Herewald the Wake after his dramatic escape from Ely? His disappearance created a vacuum that was eagerly filled by storytellers, each crafting an ending that suited their own time and political purpose. Two main contradictory narratives emerged in the decades that followed. The Gesta, written in the early 12th century, provides the most romantic conclusion, fitting of a heroic fighter who comes to accept that the new order can't be overthrown. In this version, Herewald eventually attempts to make peace with King William. He's provoked into a fight, captured, and imprisoned, but is soon freed in a daring rescue by his loyal followers. His former jailer, impressed by Herewald's character, speaks to the king on his behalf. William, respecting the spirit of his indomitable foe, finally pardons him. Herewald is allowed to reclaim his lands and live out the rest of his days in peace, even marrying a wealthy Anglo-Saxon noble widow named Alftruda. And yeah, I suppose I probably didn't have to specify that a woman named Alftruda was an Anglo-Saxon. And as a brief aside, I have to wonder when the last time a baby was named Alftruda, though I suppose I could be inviting a Bort situation in the comments here. A darker, more tragic ending is offered by the Anglo-Norman poet Geoffrey Gaimar in his History of the English, written around 1140. He claims that Herewald lived for a time as an outlaw in the woods and fens. As he was on the verge of finally making peace with the king, he was ambushed and treacherously slain by a group of vengeful Norman knights. According to this version, they couldn't forgive the losses he had inflicted upon them. Lacking any definitive evidence for either of these literary accounts, the modern historical consensus is more prosaic. Most historians believe the most plausible scenario is that Herewald simply succeeded in his escape. He likely fled to the continent, living out his life as an exile, his ultimate fate unknown and unrecorded. He vanished from the pages of history, becoming a blank slate onto which later generations could project their own hopes, fears, and ideals. This version of events is supported by the fact that Herewald definitely had connections to the continent. Fleeing the British Isles entirely would put significant distance between himself and his Norman foes. Herewald's journey from a documented Lincolnshire thane to an enduring national folk hero is a testament to the power of resistance. The verifiable facts of his life, his landholdings, his exile, and his leadership of the Ely Rebellion provided the historical nucleus around which a much larger legend could grow. In the centuries that followed, he became a potent symbol of Anglo-Saxon defiance against what became known as the Norman yoke, the sense of oppression felt by the conquered English. His story of a dispossessed noble fighting injustice from a hidden base in the wilderness established a powerful archetype in English folklore. He is, in many ways, a clear forerunner to the Greenwood outlaws who would follow, most famously Robin Hood. In the end, Herewald's failure was inevitable from the moment the Danes withdrew their tepid support for his campaign. He was a man fighting against the unstoppable tide of history, a local leader standing against the organized might of a new and ruthless state. Yet his legacy endures not because he won, but because he fought. He represents that timeless spirit of defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. His very elusiveness in the historical record is the ultimate source of his power as a legend, ensuring he would roam the misty marshes of England's collective memory forever. Imagine the scene in Coventry. The streets of an 11th century English town, normally bustling with the noise of the market, are eerily silent. Every door is barred, every window shuttered. The town holds its collective breath. Through these empty lanes rides a lone figure on horseback, a noble woman, her face a mask of determined resolve, her only covering the curtain of her own long hair. This lady's husband has agreed to lower the taxes for the town on the condition that she engage in this bizarre act, and all the townspeople have agreed to avert their gaze. This is the image of Lady Godiva, a picture of profound sacrifice, a woman willing to endure the ultimate public humiliation to save her people from the crushing weight of her husband's taxes. The story has been repeated as fact now for almost 1,000 years, but historians question whether the tale of Lady Godiva's ride has any truth to it whatsoever. The first step in separating fact from fiction is to get her name right. The woman we know as Lady Godiva was, in her own time, called God-Gifu. It's an Old English name meaning God's gift, and the name Godiva is simply a later, Latinized version that stuck. God-Gifu lived through one of the most violent and unstable periods in English history. Born in the 900s, her life spanned the reigns of no fewer than 9 different kings. She lived through the reign of Ethelred the Unready, through the Danish conquest, and all the way to the Norman conquest of 1066. She was a witness to the death of Anglo-Saxon England and the birth of a new Norman dynasty. God-Gifu wasn't just a bystander to these events. She was at the very heart of English power. She was married to Leofric, the Earl of Mercia, who was one of the 3 most powerful and influential men in the entire kingdom. Leofric was a formidable political figure, a kingmaker who was instrumental in securing the throne for Harold Harefoot after Canute's death in 1035. Together, God-Gifu and Leofric were a true power couple, controlling immense wealth and territory. Their family was a dynasty in its own right. Their son, Elfgar, inherited the earldom, and their granddaughter, Eldgith, would go on to marry King Harold Godwinson. This would make their granddaughter the last Anglo-Saxon Queen of England. Here, we encounter the first major collision between the legend and the historical record. The story of the ride depends entirely on the idea that Godiva was a virtuous, but ultimately powerless woman. able only to plead with her husband to show mercy. The real God Gifu was anything but powerless, and unlike in later centuries under Norman rule, Anglo-Saxon law afforded women significant legal and economic rights. Crucially, they could inherit, purchase, and own property entirely independently of their husbands. God Gifu was one of the wealthiest landowners of her era, amongst both men and women. She held vast estates in her own right across the heart of Mercia, in regions like Leicestershire, Warwickshire, and Shropshire. The most definitive proof of her status comes from the Domesday Book. This massive survey, compiled by William the Conqueror in 1086, was designed to record exactly who owned what in his new kingdom. The survey was conducted after God Gifu's death, yet it still lists her extensive pre-conquest land holdings. Remarkably, it identifies her as one of the only Anglo-Saxons, and the only Anglo-Saxon woman, to have remained a major landholder after the Norman invasion. This is a stunning testament to her influence and power, a status so immense that even the new Norman regime had to formally acknowledge it. But the most critical fact of all is that the small but growing settlement of Coventry was one of God Gifu's personal estates. It belonged to her directly, not to her husband Leofric. This historical reality presents a fundamental challenge to the legend. The story of the ride was first written down in the 13th century, nearly 200 years after God Gifu lived. By that time, the more patriarchal legal system of the Normans was firmly in place, which tied land ownership to military service and heavily favored male inheritance. A 13th century monk would have viewed the world through this lens, naturally assuming that the Earl, as the man, held ultimate authority over all lands and taxes within his domain. The legend he recorded, therefore, isn't just a fanciful tale. It's an anachronism. It projects the legal assumptions of the Norman world back onto an Anglo-Saxon past where a woman wielding independent power to that level had become almost unthinkable. So, if God Gifu was such a prominent figure, why is there no mention of her famous ride in any document from her own time? This is perhaps the single most compelling piece of evidence against the story's historicity. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a detailed year-by-year account of events in England, is silent on the matter. No contemporary records of any kind refer to this extraordinary and scandalous event involving one of the realm's most important noblewomen. For nearly 200 years after her death, God Gifu was remembered as a pious benefactor of churches, along with her husband. The story of the ride appears for the first time, seemingly out of nowhere, around the year 1235. It was recorded in a Latin chronicle called the Flores Historiarum, or Flowers of History, compiled by a monk named Roger of Wendover at St. Albans Abbey. Wendover and his successor, Matthew Paris, were known for being enthusiastic collectors of folklore. Interestingly, Wendover's original version is quite different from the one we know today. In his telling, God Gifu does ride through the marketplace covered only by her long hair. However, she's not alone, but rather attended by two knights, also traveling on horseback, who shielded her from view. Over the following centuries, the story was retold and refined, with each generation adding new layers that heightened the drama and moral clarity. First, the two knights who accompanied her were quietly dropped from the narrative, leaving Godiva to ride completely alone and amplifying her courage and personal risk. Later, the detail was added that Godiva herself had ordered the townspeople to stay inside and not look, transforming the story into one of mutual respect between the lady and her people. The most famous addition to the story, however, came much later and would be one of the standout features of the legend. The character of Peeping Tom, which is where that phrase comes from, was added in the 16th century. Peeping Tom agreed not to look, along with all the other townspeople, but he was rendered blind as divine punishment for sneaking a peek. It changed the story from simply a tale of economic injustice to a morality narrative about the consequences of disrespect. When we place the fully formed legend alongside the historical facts, the entire narrative structure begins to collapse. The story is riddled with inconsistencies and anachronisms that make it historically implausible. First, there's the problem of the place. The legend is set in Coventry's bustling marketplace. But in the mid-11th century, Coventry was a tiny settlement, little more than a village with a population of a few hundred people centered around the monastery. It simply wouldn't have had a large public marketplace for such a dramatic ride. The chroniclers were describing the Coventry of their own time when it did have a large marketplace to ride through. Second, and most importantly, is the problem of power. As we've seen, God Gifu personally owned the estate of Coventry. Under Anglo-Saxon law, if a local toll was oppressing the residents, she possessed the legal authority to reduce or abolish it herself. The central conflict of the legend, a wife pleading with her husband, is based on a complete misunderstanding of her actual power. Simply put, God Gifu was the one who held all the cards in Coventry, not Leofric. And while he certainly could have influenced her, this was her holding, not his. This is, of course, working under the assumption that this was a tax which the Earl was entitled to levy personally. Third is the problem of the tax itself. Some accounts suggest the levy in question was the Heergeld, or army tax. This wasn't a local toll invented by a greedy earl. It was a national land tax levied by the king to pay for the defense of the entire realm against Viking invasion. As a royal tax, Earl Leofric's role was simply to collect it. He had no authority to cancel it for a single village. An appeal would have had to go directly to the king, making God Gifu's protest to her husband pointless. Finally, there is the problem of Leofric's character. The legend requires him to be a cruel ruler of his domain, yet historical sources paint a picture of a shrewd and respected statesman whose marriage to God Gifu was a partnership, evidenced by their many joint religious foundations. Finally, there's the problem of what he has her do. Anglo-Saxon England was heavily based upon honor, and having a wife who engaged in salacious and scandalous activities would be seen as a mark upon Earl Leofric's character. By forcing his wife of all people to ride through Coventry in such a state, by the logic of his own time, he was in essence engaging in a self-humiliation ritual on a grand scale. If the ride never happened, historians have tried to understand how such a strangely specific story came to be. One theory is that it was simply just made up by the chroniclers, and they grafted on a popular and well-known historical figure to make it more interesting. Under this theory, essentially they did the medieval equivalent of adding a popular public domain character like Dracula to a video game or movie. However, the most plausible theory suggests the legend is a dramatic misinterpretation of a common act of Christian penance. In Anglo-Saxon England, individuals who had committed serious sins could be assigned a public penance. A central element of this ritual was humility. A high-status penitent would be required to appear in public stripped of all signs of their rank. They would walk barefoot, dressed only in simple plain clothes, without any jewelry or other markers of their nobility. For a powerful countess like God Gifu, being seen in public without her finery would have been a profound act of humility. Under this theory, God Gifu, who was a highly religious person, even by the standards of the time, may have participated in such an act of penitence. This act was then misinterpreted through a game of intergenerational telephone, when Roger of Wendover came into contact with the story. From there it was embellished and reframed. In the final analysis, the historical consensus is fairly clear that the ride of Lady Godiva almost certainly never happened. Even though it contains no overtly fantastical elements, it's almost certainly just as much of a legend as a tale of a knight confronting a dragon. The historical Godgifu was a real person. She was a powerful, pious, and influential Anglo-Saxon noblewoman who left her mark on the historical record through her wealth and her faith. Lady Godiva, the legendary figure, is an icon of compassion, courage, and economic justice, and while she's based on her, the historical god Gifu and the figure of Lady Godiva are separate. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy just reminding you to click the like button and subscribe if you've learned something so far in this video. Also, don't forget to check out my podcast, Lazy Chill True Crime, if you're in the mood for something completely different. The link to the podcast is in the description. Now with all that said, let's get back to business. In 1786, an unknown sailor would be slain in a manner so brutal that the story is still remembered till this day. Our story begins on September 24th in that same year at the Red Lion Inn in the village of Thursley in England. An unknown sailor, whose name has been lost to history, was returning to duty, heading on foot back to his ship docked at Portsmouth. Inside the cozy tavern, he met three sailors, James Marshall, Michael Casey, and Edward Lonegon. By all accounts, these men seemed friendly enough. The unknown sailor, described later as generous but unfortunate, welcomed their company and paid for rounds of drinks and a hot meal for the group. Such kindness wasn't unusual among wayfarers bonding over a pint, and perhaps the lonely traveler felt safer in numbers for the long road ahead. What he didn't know was that Marshall, Casey, and Lonegon were already sizing him up as prey. When the stranger pulled out a gold coin to settle the bill, it likely kindled disturbing ideas in the others' minds. The sailors left the Red Lion together at dusk, ostensibly to continue south toward Hindhead, a village located not too far away. Tragically, the friendly stranger had unwittingly thrown in his lot with three men who saw his kindness as weakness and his very modest wealth as an opportunity. A couple of miles beyond Thursley, the narrow road wound into the high, desolate terrain of Hindhead Hill. At some lonely stretch outside the village, Marshall, Casey, and Lonegon sprang their trap. Under the cover of darkness, they ambushed their charitable fellow traveler. Later reports describe a ferocious attack, with the sailor almost beheaded in the assault. The three assailants stripped the victim of his clothes and possessions, presumably to rob him of anything of value. They dragged his limp, bloodied body off the road and rolled it down into a deep, brush-filled valley locally known by the eerie name of the Devil's Punch Bowl. Believing they had concealed the evidence of their heinous deed, the perpetrator hurriedly fled the scene with the sailors' clothes bundled under their arms. What the three men didn't realize was that their crime had not gone entirely unwitnessed. By sheer chance, there were eyewitnesses nearby on that hillside. Two local men crossing nearby glimpsed figures dumping what looked like a bundle or body down the slope. Fearful of confronting three desperate characters in the dark, these witnesses kept their distance until the trio moved on. Only then did they venture closer and make the gruesome discovery. Horrified, the locals raced back down the road to raise the alarm at the nearest inn. The alarm was first sounded back at the Red Lion in Thursley. Without delay, an impromptu posse of townsfolk formed to find the three men. Despite their rudimentary organization, these residents of 18th century rural England were resolute. The slaying on their doorstep would not go unanswered. They took off into the night, following the London to Portsmouth road in pursuit of the three fugitives. Meanwhile, Marshall, Casey, and Lonegon hurried southward, eager to convert their spoils into money, but their downfall came quickly. A few hours after the attack, the trio stopped at another inn along the Portsmouth Road and brazenly tried to sell the stolen clothing and belongings of their victim. As the three criminals haggled over the price of a sailor's jacket and pack, local authorities and the Thursley posse closed in. The Thursley posse bust in, and a scrap broke out between the three criminals and the armed men. Locals at the inn joined in and attacked the perpetrators, and by night's end, all three were under arrest and bound for jail. With the suspects in custody, the local authorities wasted no time in securing evidence. In an era before modern forensics, proof of guilt often relied on eyewitness testimony and the possession of stolen goods. In this case, the evidence was overwhelming. Multiple witnesses could place Marshall, Casey, and Longon with the victim that day. Further, the bloodied clothing and belongings of the sailor were literally in their hands when they were captured. Yet beyond these tangible facts, the investigators resorted to a grim traditional custom to drive home the truth of the crime. On the journey to jail, the captors made a macabre detour. They brought the three accused back to a cottage where the corpse had been laid out and compelled each man to touch the lifeless body of the sailor. According to a persistent folk belief of the time, the wounds of a victim would bleed again in the presence of the true perpetrator. While this has sometimes been framed as a superstition-infused attempt to invoke divine justice, this wasn't the case in the 18th century. In the medieval period, there was a genuine belief in this method for proving guilt, but by this time it was essentially the Enlightenment era equivalent of a polygraph test. That is to say, it worked because a lot of people still superstitiously believed a corpse would bleed in the presence of the perpetrator. By forcing the men to press their hands hard against the freshly lifeless body of the unknown sailor, the authorities knew what would happen, and it worked. According to one account of what happened next, the three men were separated and introduced to the body separately, ostensibly to test who was actually involved in the slaying. The first two of the sailors pressed the lifeless body and had no reaction whatsoever. The third man ended up giving all them away. He pressed on the body, saw the blood, and broke down and confessed to what he and his comrades had done, sealing the fate of every man involved. Justice in the 18th century could move swiftly, and so it did for this case. The three defendants languished in jail through the winter of 1786, awaiting the next court to convene. On April 5, 1787, a brief trial was held for all the men, and the evidence against Marshall, Casey, and Longon was straightforward and damning. Multiple innkeepers and locals from along the Portsmouth Road testified to seeing the quartet together and later seeing the suspects alone with the victim's goods. The stolen clothing, recovered from the men at the time of arrest, was presented as physical proof. Their final nail in the coffin, quite literally, was the confession of one of the men. With no credible defense to speak of, the jury needed little deliberation, and the three were sentenced to a public hanging, which was the style at the time. Unlike modern cases where condemned individuals sit around for decades working through the appeals process, the crowds wanted their entertainment. Just 2 days after the conviction, on April 7th, 1787, the sentence was carried out in dramatic fashion. Marshall, Casey, and Longon were transported back to Hindhead Hill under heavy guard. A massive crowd gathered from miles around to witness the event. As a quick aside, I wasn't joking when I said the people wanted their entertainment. Public hangings in the 18th century often attracted large crowds and had a carnival-like atmosphere, and it wasn't uncommon for vendors to sell food, drink, and trinkets at the event. Officially, in England, they were public spectacles meant to deter crime, and people would arrive early to get good viewing spots, especially for high-profile cases. If the case was high-profile enough, Viewers could even get overpriced pamphlets describing the crimes committed as a dark memento of the event. Notably, the tacky circus-like atmosphere around these events eventually became an embarrassment, which led to the end of public hangings in the 19th century. The authorities pulled out all the stops for this event. At the very spot overlooking the Devil's Punch Bowl, where the unnamed sailor had met his end, a gallows had been erected for additional effect. The authorities also built an unusual three-armed gallows so that all three men could be hanged simultaneously, supposedly as a singular example of deterrence. Regardless of the intent, the three men dropped in unison to the cheers of raucous crowds. The bodies of Marshall, Casey, and Lone Gun were then doused in tar and suspended in iron cages, where they were left to rot where they hung. For years after, travelers on the Portsmouth Road could gaze up at the ghastly sight of three skeletons dangling there as a warning to any who might contemplate such cruelty. While the perpetrators met a disgraceful end, the unknown sailor was treated with honor and compassion by the community he had briefly touched. Villagers recovered his remains and prepared a proper burial. Though no kin came forward to lay claim, the people of Thursley adopted the sailor as their own in death. They interred him in St. Michael's churchyard with all the rites befitting a local friend and compatriot. Then, in a remarkable gesture of collective empathy, locals took up a collection to erect a gravestone over the sailor's grave. That headstone, which still stands today, is a poignant and elaborate memorial. At its top is etched a depiction of the attack itself, three assailants attacking their victim, and below is an inscription written in verse. The epitaph tells the story of the unknown sailor who offered kindness and received only villainy in return. From the very beginning, the mystery of the victim's identity has loomed over this tale. The unknown sailor went to his grave without a name. But that hasn't stopped generations from wondering who he really was. Witnesses described him as being a younger man in his late 20s up to his mid-30s. He spoke of heading to Portsmouth to rejoin his ship, which implies he was on shore leave or had been visiting family or had business in London. These hints suggest he was potentially simply a serviceman returning to duty. For 2 centuries, there were effectively no clues that were publicly known until historian Peter Morey dug into family lore and newspaper archives. In a 2000 book, he highlighted a 1932 letter from Anne Macmillan to the local newspaper. She claimed the victim was her great-uncle, brother to Samuel Hardman of the 10th Light Dragoons. She recalled he came from a prosperous Lambeth family and left an unclaimed inheritance. Notably, the name of this uncle wasn't noted in the letter, but this allowed the web to be unraveled slightly. Morey then confirmed Samuel Hardman's existence in Lambeth and uncovered an Edward Hardman born there in 1752, who was Samuel's brother. Given that Edward would have been in his mid-30s, if Anne's letter was accurate, this would make him a strong candidate for the unknown sailor. Though no naval records explicitly name Edward, this theory offers the most convincing identity yet. Interestingly, we have a preserved gravesite for the unknown sailor, and given that we know the family he's supposedly connected to, this case could actually be solved. DNA analysis could either prove or disprove if the unknown sailor is related to this family. Further, it's possible that even if this doesn't work, genetic genealogy could be used to get a better sense of who he was. Notably, while England has stricter laws about this sort of thing, it's almost certain that someone from this man's family immigrated to America or Canada in the meantime. If so, their genetic information may be used to provide a clue as to who the unknown sailor is. From there, it would be possible to go through Royal Navy archives and determine if a potentially connected sailor failed to report back for duty. That said, of course, this is working under the assumption that there's a surviving muster roll, but it's a distinct possibility.